There is a kind of courage that never makes the history books. It does not appear in battlefield dispatches or in the accounts of explorers. It leaves no monument behind, no visible scar, no story dramatic enough to tell at dinner. It happens in the early hours of ordinary mornings, in the silence between waking and getting up, in the moment when the full weight of a life presses down and a person, knowing everything, feeling everything, chooses to continue. Viktor Frankl spent his life trying to understand this courage, and in the end he concluded that it was the most important kind there is. Frankl arrived at his understanding of courage through the most brutal of laboratories. In September 1942, he was deported with his wife and parents to the Theresienstadt concentration camp. His father died there of exhaustion and pneumonia. Later, Frankl was separated from his wife and transferred through Auschwitz to the Kaufering and Turkheim camps, satellite camps of Dachau. For nearly 3 years, he lived in conditions designed to extinguish not merely life but the very sense that life could mean anything. The Nazis had stripped him of his manuscript, his family, his physical freedom, his professional identity, everything that the outer world uses to tell a person who they are. What they could not strip from him, he would later write, was the last of the human freedoms, the freedom to choose one's attitude toward any given set of circumstances. But Frankl was careful never to romanticize this freedom. He did not claim that attitude choosing was easy, or that it came naturally to people in extremis. Most people, he observed, did not find it. Most people in the camps were swept away, into apathy, into hatred, into the slow dissolution of self that the Nazis intended. The ones who maintained their inner freedom were a minority, and Frankl was unflinching about this. What made them different was not superior willpower or exceptional character in any conventional sense. What made them different was that they had something to live for. They had found, or retained, or desperately constructed, some fragment of meaning that made continued existence feel like something more than a biological accident. This is where Frankl's understanding of courage departs fundamentally from the popular conception. In popular usage, courage is usually conceived as the absence of fear, or at least the overcoming of it. The courageous person is the one who faces danger without flinching, who charges into battle without hesitation, who confronts the difficult thing without betraying the effort it costs them. This conception is ancient. It runs through the Stoics, through Aristotle, through the warrior traditions of every culture. And it is not without merit. But Frankl saw something else, something the warrior tradition tends to miss. True courage, as Frankl understood it, is not primarily about the relationship between a person and danger. It is about the relationship between a person and meaning. A soldier can be brave because the military context provides a ready-made framework of meaning: the unit, the mission, the nation, the cause. The adrenaline of combat provides its own strange momentum. Remove that framework, remove the adrenaline, remove the cause, and leave a person alone in genuine powerlessness, stripped of role, of purpose, of social identity, of physical comfort, and then ask what remains. That remainder, that residue of orientation toward life, is what Frankl called existential courage. And it is far harder to sustain than anything the battlefield demands. In the camps, Frankl observed what happened to people when conventional meaning structures dissolved. The first thing that went, usually, was the future. Prisoners were forbidden from thinking about when the camp would end, or whether they would survive, or what they would do afterward. The camp administration enforced a kind of radical present-tense existence. You existed only for the next roll call, the next bowl of watery soup, the next brutal morning. Frankl noticed that the prisoners who collapsed psychologically were almost always the ones who had surrendered the future. They had accepted, at some level, that there was nothing to look forward to. And once the future is gone, the past becomes unbearable, because the past represents everything that was and is now lost, and the present becomes merely a corridor through which suffering passes. But some prisoners refused this surrender. And Frankl watched them carefully, because they fascinated him. They were not always the physically strongest. They were not always the most educated or the most intellectually sophisticated. What they shared was a peculiar orientation toward time and toward existence. They behaved as though the future was still real, still theirs, still worth protecting. One man thought constantly about his children, who had escaped to England. Another was a scientist who had unfinished research he was determined to complete. Frankl himself thought about the manuscript that had been confiscated at the gates of Auschwitz, a manuscript he had spent years writing, his first major statement of logotherapy, and felt a burning compulsion to reconstruct it, to finish it, to bring it into the world. These were not fantasies of escape. They were commitments, obligations felt in the marrow, responsibilities towards something or someone beyond the self. Frankl later codified this observation into one of the central insights of logotherapy, that meaning is not merely pleasant to have, not merely a luxury of comfortable existence, it is a biological and psychological necessity. Its absence produces what he called the existential vacuum, a state of inner emptiness that is not simply unhappiness but something more dangerous, a kind of motivational paralysis in which the person can see no reason to prefer one action over another, no reason to struggle when struggling costs so much. The existential vacuum, he observed, is the precondition for what he called collective neurosis, the mass phenomena of aggression, depression, and addiction that characterize modern societies, and it is also the precondition for the psychological collapse he witnessed in the camps. Courage, then, in Frankl's framework, is the capacity to maintain one's orientation toward meaning even when all the external supports of meaning have been removed. This is not an act performed once, heroically, on a significant day. It is a practice performed constantly, obscurely, in the smallest decisions of daily life. In the camps, courage looked like this: getting up when every physical impulse screamed to stay down. Sharing a piece of bread when keeping it would increase one's own survival odds. Offering a word of comfort to someone worse off when one's own reserves were nearly exhausted. Refusing to treat fellow prisoners as objects. Maintaining, in the face of systematic dehumanization, the inner conviction that one's actions still mattered, that how one behaved in this extremity would still count for something, even if no one ever knew. Frankl wrote with particular intensity about what he called the spiritual resistance of the prisoners, their refusal to let the camps define them entirely. He described evenings when exhausted prisoners gathered not to sleep but to listen to improvised lectures, to share poetry, to perform crude theatre. He described a man who insisted on washing every morning in a thin stream of dirty water, not because it did any good hygienically but because the act of washing preserved something, some inner declaration that he was still a human being who maintained standards. Frankl saw these acts not as sentimental gestures but as genuine courage, the courage to insist on one's own humanity in conditions specifically designed to negate it. This understanding has radical implications for how we think about courage in ordinary life. If Frankl is right, and the evidence of his clinical work, his philosophical analysis, and his own survival suggests powerfully that he is, then courage is not primarily the property of exceptional individuals in exceptional circumstances. It is a dimension of human existence that everyone encounters, usually in forms far less dramatic but no less real than what Frankl faced. The person who goes to work every morning despite a chronic illness that never fully relents, who chooses, day after day, to engage with life rather than retreat from it, is exercising existential courage. The parent who raises children after losing a spouse, who holds the family together not because it is easy but because those children need someone to hold them, that person is exercising existential courage. The grieving individual who allows grief to transform rather than destroy, who finds, slowly and without any guarantee of success, a way to carry loss into continued life, that person is exercising existential courage. Frankl was particularly interested in what he called attitudinal values, the values expressed not in what a person creates or experiences but in how a person bears what cannot be changed. He considered this the highest form of human achievement, not success, not genius, not beauty, but the quiet transformation of an unavoidable fate into a personal testimony of human dignity. He wrote of a woman in the camps who knew she would die within days. She was young, she had been vibrant and full of plans. And yet Frankl found her, in her final days, in a state not of despair but of extraordinary composure. She pointed to a chestnut tree outside her barrack window, a tree she could see through a small hole in the wall, and she spoke to it as though it were alive, as though it were listening. She told Frankl that this tree was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She said she knew she was going to die, and she was at peace, because she had managed to say yes to the tree, yes to the world, yes to life itself, even now. Frankl considered this woman one of the most genuinely courageous people he had ever encountered. There is a concept in Frankl's work that he borrowed and transformed from the philosopher Max Scheler, the idea of the person as irreducible. For Scheler, and for Frankl, the human person is not identical with their psychology, their history, their social role, or their biological drives. There is something in the person, what Frankl called the neutic dimension, the dimension of the spirit, that cannot be fully captured by any deterministic account. It is this irreducible core that makes freedom possible, because freedom requires an agent that is not entirely determined by prior causes. And it is this same irreducible core that makes courage possible, because courage requires a self that can orient itself, however partially, however imperfectly, towards something beyond itself. This is why Frankl was so resistant to both Freudian and behaviorist accounts of human motivation. Freud located the ultimate driver of human behavior in the unconscious, in drives that operate beneath and despite conscious intention. The behaviorists located it in conditioning, in patterns of reinforcement that shape behavior from the outside. Both accounts leave little room for genuine choice. They describe a human being who is, at bottom, a mechanism, however complex. Frankl did not deny that unconscious forces exist or that conditioning shapes behavior, but he insisted that they do not exhaust the human person. There is a dimension of human existence that is irreducibly free, not infinitely free, not free from all constraint, but genuinely free in the sense that really matters, free to take a stand toward whatever conditions life imposes. And the exercise of that freedom, particularly under conditions of maximum adversity, is what Frankl meant by courage. In his clinical work after the war, Frankl used this understanding of courage therapeutically. He was not interested in helping patients feel better in a superficial sense. He was interested in helping them encounter themselves, to discover what they were capable of, what they cared about most deeply, what they could not abandon without betraying something essential in themselves. He used a technique he called Socratic dialogue, in which he asked probing questions not to instruct but to draw out what the patient already knew at some level but had not yet articulated. He would ask, "What is it that only you can do? What obligation do you feel that no one else could fulfill in your place? If you imagine yourself at the end of your life, looking back, what would it mean to say that you had lived it fully?" These questions were not rhetorical. They were diagnostic. And what they frequently revealed was that the patient's sense of meaninglessness was not the result of a genuine absence of meaning, but of a failure to recognize or commit to the meaning that was already present in their lives. Frankl understood that this recognition requires courage. It is easier, in many ways, to remain in the existential vacuum, to insist that nothing matters, that there is no reason to try, that the world is meaningless and resistance is futile. This stance carries a certain grim comfort. It absolves the person of responsibility. If nothing matters, one need not risk anything, need not commit to anything, need not face the possibility of trying and failing at something that genuinely matters. Nihilism, Frankl observed, is not always a philosophical position arrived at through rigorous reasoning. Often it is a defense mechanism, a way of protecting the self from the terrifying vulnerability of caring about something. The courage Frankl called for was the courage to care, to acknowledge what one values, what one loves, what one feels responsible for, and then to act in accordance with that acknowledgement, even knowing that loss is possible, that failure is possible, that the effort may not be rewarded. This is not naive optimism. Frankl was clear that tragic outcomes are real, that suffering is genuine, that some losses cannot be recovered from. His concept of tragic optimism acknowledges this squarely. One can maintain an orientation toward meaning even while acknowledging that life contains irremediable darkness. Courage does not require the pretense that everything will work out. It requires only the willingness to continue engaging with life as though one's choices still matter, because, Frankl insisted, they do. The philosophical tradition offers a concept that captures something of what Frankl was pointing to, the Stoic idea of the prepon, the fitting action, the response that is appropriate to the situation, that expresses the best that a human being can offer in the specific circumstances they find themselves in. For the Stoics, this was a matter of rational discernment. For Frankl, it was something more, not just discernment but commitment, not just seeing what is fitting but having the courage to do it even when everything in one's exhausted organism would prefer to do nothing. In his later years, Frankl returned again and again to the theme of courage in a specific modern context. He was deeply concerned about what he called the existential vacuum in contemporary Western culture, the widespread sense of meaninglessness that he saw spreading through industrial societies. He attributed this partly to the erosion of traditional frameworks, religious, cultural, familial, that had previously given people a sense of purpose and belonging. Without these frameworks, people were left to construct meaning for themselves, and many found this too difficult, too frightening, or simply too unfamiliar. The result was a mass retreat into distraction, into consumption, into the pursuit of pleasure and power, not because these things genuinely satisfy the will to meaning, but because they provide relief from the anxiety of confronting the question of what one's life is for. Frankl saw the courage required to face this question, to sit with it, to take it seriously, to refuse the easy answers of consumerism and conformity, as one of the central challenges of the modern age. He was not optimistic in any facile sense. He knew that cultural forces were powerful and that the erosion of meaning was a genuine historical phenomenon that individual courage could not simply reverse. But he believed, with the conviction of a man who had survived Auschwitz, that individuals retain the capacity to find and create meaning regardless of cultural conditions. The capacity is not automatic. It requires effort, reflection, and above all, courage. But it is there, available, in every human person, a birthright that no camp, no culture, no catastrophe can entirely extinguish. Frankl himself embodied the courage he described. After the war, after the loss of his wife and most of his family, he did not retreat into bitterness or despair, though he would have had every reason to. He rebuilt. He wrote. He lectured. He established the Logotherapy Institute in Vienna. He married again, had a daughter, and found in these relationships the experimental values that complemented the creative work to which he dedicated his professional life. He traveled the world, speaking to audiences of psychiatrists, philosophers, soldiers, students, bringing to each audience his fundamental message, that human beings are capable of more than they think, that suffering does not have to be the last word, that the worst the world can do cannot reach the innermost core of what a person is. In 1991, when Frankl was in his mid-80s, he was asked in an interview what had kept him going through so much loss and difficulty. He paused for a moment and then said something that has stayed with those who heard it, that each morning, when he got up, he made a choice. Not a dramatic choice, not a philosophical exercise, just a small, private decision to say yes to whatever the day would bring. He said this choice was not always easy. Some mornings it cost him something. But he had made it so many times, for so many years, that it had become, not automatic, but natural. A part of who he was. This was courage, he said. Not the absence of difficulty, not the mastery of fear, just the daily yes, repeated until it becomes a life. And perhaps that is the deepest teaching of Viktor Frankl's long and extraordinary life, that courage is not a quality you either have or don't have. It is a practice. It is something you do, in the ordinary moments, in the small decisions, in the way you meet each day as it comes. It is the willingness to keep showing up, to life, to meaning, to the specific and irreplaceable demands of your own existence, even when showing up is hard. Especially when it is hard. In this, as in so much else, the man who survived Auschwitz offers the rest of us a compass, not a map with all the answers marked out, but a direction, forward, into life, with the quiet and undramatic courage of someone who knows why they are going.